It's a massive campus, isn't it?
It's huge.
I mean, really, I'm sure it wasn't as big as that in 1962. Um, I'm 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 absolutely convinced it's grown, but then it would have to, because in 1962 there were only 2,500 students, I think.
Okay.
Um, and now on the website it seems to be, much bigger. Um, Part of that, I think, was when they closed other schools around it, so they consolidated, sort of like the various schools into the one, as uh, integration became more complete. In 1962, there was the Black Students' School, Dunbar High School, not very far away actually, as I can see it, um, and EC Glass was just for white students, and the two students who came in January 29, 29th of January 1962, were the first two students, the first two Afro-American students who actually broke the barrier of segregation at the school. Um, and that was the result of a, a, a really um, hard fought um, law case against the public school providers. Um, it got very, very complicated, and they were the first two students to win the case. So they were the first two to come into the school. There were two more students who joined in September of 1962, but I think that was because their appeal was held up, and they seemed to be coming from a different argument, a different legal argument, um, to Linda Woodruff.
Did
Um,
they join your year group, or were they older or younger than you?
they were slightly younger than me. They were 14. I was trying to work out the years. I was 15, and I think that was the year that I just completely broke down and ended up spending the next couple of years in and out. Well, in hospital, not really out of hospital. So that was effectively the end of my education at EC Glass, because I think they came in the end of January. Martin Luther King came down to support them through I think the Southern Baptist Conference. He was invited down, and because something so notable was happening, he actually came to EC Glass and spoke at EC Glass, as far as I can see, um, which was an amazing thing to have done. Um, I think I remember the young people coming to the school just as something that I know that happened, because my memory is so hazy. I think, as I said to you, I don't even know where we used to live. I used to come to school on a school bus, so I have no sense of direction or location really, other than looking at the Google map. Um, and it's certainly, as I said, it's quite significant that looking at it today, the campus is enormous. Um,
It's quite big. I guess it's all around like this square block, isn't it? Shall I pop the person down so we can have a look at what the school
that,
looks like?
that would be great, Jess. Thank you.
So I guess this is the school. Let me find a better. There's too many trees. Can't see it this way.
Yeah, it is a lot of it, that area is actually quite green. Lynchburg is a funny place. It's although it's a city, there we are. That's the entrance, isn't it? Although it's a city, it's not enormous. Um, I think the entrance is more or less unchanged, because the school bus used to drop us as you've just come up the path, the road. Um, I think it's actually like a school road. I think it's not a general road, but I think we used to get dropped from the school bus and come in here. Um, I can't remember much about my subjects other than I was taking Latin and algebra. Um, and at that point, I was starting to struggle because my mental health was just so poor. Um, and I think, you know, it, it was significant that in those days, there really wasn't support in terms of mental health for young people in the same way that hopefully there is today. Um, the Glass family apparently were like the most powerful family in Lynchburg, um, and that's why they obviously endowed the high school, and that's why it's called EC Glass. And I noticed going through the yearbooks that in a subsequent year there was a young lassie who was a Glass. She was a member of that family, but my dad got transferred there because he was an electronics engineer in communications, interestingly enough. And he got a job. It must have been with General Electric. Um, and they cited themselves there because the restrictions, the labour restrictions, were easier to get round in Lynchburg. Um, my dad wasn't a particularly political man. He had fairly open politics, in as much as he would talk to people. He wasn't a fascist by any means, but he would talk to people. He was on a plane once. He was sent by his company to China, and Richard Nixon was on the plane. And he said that he thought Richard Nixon was actually quite a nice man, which I find, looking back, very strange. But I think that's why we were in Lynchburg, and we stayed in Lynchburg um, until my dad got posted back to London with the company. I think. No, actually, that's not true. We moved up to Washington. Um, I was still in institution. I was in a state institution by this time, so I wasn't really involved in that. So I was released from the state institution because I wasn't an American citizen, and my family were leaving the country, so we came over to London on a couple of years posting with my dad, and I went into the Maudsley effectively to try and rehabilitate a bit from everything that had been going on. But no, this was the last place that I had formal education according to my age. So it's interesting to see it. As I say, I think Owen and Linda were a year younger than me, so they would have come in as ninth graders. I would have been in the 10th grade by this time, which is called sophomore. They would have been freshmen at ninth grade.
I'm not so sure. I get very confused about the American school grading system from watching American films. Do you know if they were the first Black children to attend an all-white school in America, or were there other places that had done it previously?
I think there were other places doing it. I've got a feeling Georgia and Alabama, they were following up the civil rights movements and the marches and the actions that had taken place down there. But it would have been very, very early days. It was still very early in the process of desegregation and integration. And the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King came and spoke at the school, I think is really significant, in as much as they did need the support. I think it was very difficult as well. I read a report from Linda, well, she was a professor when she died, Professor Linda Woodruff wrote, where she said that um, I think EC Glass must have played Dunbar, and so she went and sat with her friends, the people that she'd started her course year with at Dunbar before she'd had to leave, and they just got up and left, and she was left sitting alone. I think she was very, very isolated within both communities. Owen, um, Owen Cardwell, Owen Cardwell Jr. Was the other student, and I read a report that he said that they went into the cafeteria to have their lunch, only to find that as he went up to a table, the other students got up and left. So the isolation, I think, must have been quite extreme. Although the students, I don't recall the students actually protesting. If there was any protesting, I think it was the parents. But the older students who perhaps were more under the influence of their parents, and the ones that were protesting were probably the ones that just didn't want anything to do with black students.
Do you know when like EC Glass finally became fully integrated?
I've got a feeling it was about 1970. I'm
Okay.
sure it was about 1970. So quite a few years later, they had intended to bring a student in grade by grade, so that each year there'd be, a couple more students coming in. But in a school of that size, of 2,500, it was much too big to tolerate that, which is, again, I think why Dr. Martin Luther King came. The school itself, Dunbar School, I'm sure was shut around 1970. And looking at the website for the school today, um, one of the things they seem to be particularly proud of is the integration, the mixture of students within the school body. Um, so, sort of, I guess it took, what is it, a long time. I'm just trying to work out the years. It's sort of 50 odd years, isn't it? Sort of in excess of 50 years to achieve that balance. But they were very difficult times. I found them very confusing because I was English, although my family had immigrated and we had come down from Canada. My family were sort of like we basically sort of post-war left London and came across to Canada to try and get. My dad wanted to get work, which he couldn't get in England because we were still going through basically sort of reconstruction post-war. So he was offered a post in Canada, and that's how my family came to be in North America. And then with my dad's need to move on in order to continue to progress in his field, we went first to the Midwest, then to North Carolina, and then here in Lynchburg, and ended up in Washington, D.C., South Washington. And I think that was a common story, but we were outsiders. And in truth, I wanted to make a film about this myself, but I'm not allowed back in the country. I'm an undesirable alien, which I think is, on the one hand, it's quite funny, but on the other hand, it's a source of some considerable pain, because I have still got friends in the States who I can only see if they come over here on holiday, which of course isn't happening currently anyway. But I had friends who I've now lost, who I would have loved to have seen. But I'm the only one in my family that's banned, which is interesting. Is the price of being disabled.
Shall we have a look around the outside of the school?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's there's leaves on the trees. In that January, as I recall, it was very, very cold. And actually, there's blue badge parking, isn't there?
There is.
That's interesting. But it was snow. There was snow everywhere. There, there's sort of like the climate can be very harsh there, although it's quite sheltered. It can be terribly harsh. I'm interested to see it's ranked as well, which is nice, isn't it? It's nice to see.
Yeah,
As I said, I think things happily have changed since 1962.
the picture that you sent me of the two students, I forget their names again. Sorry, was it Owen?
Owen Cardwell Jr. and Linda Woodruff.
It was really heavily snowing in the photograph outside the school.
That's exactly right.
I've not seen snow like that before. Well, obviously in photographs and on footage, but not in real life.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, they would have been dropped. I think they're either the lawyer or one of the parents, or probably both of the parents, dropped them at the entrance that we were looking at just now. And they would have had to climb those steps, and they would have had to come into the school via that very, very imposing sort of fronted sort of architecture. I say this, yeah, this is a private road effectively, and I think the idea is that effectively that this is where the kids get dropped off, and that it's been made so.
So did they have to do like a court appeal to be able to attend the school? Is that what was happening at the time?
That's exactly right. The parents applied for them to attend EC Glass, and it was turned down. That application was turned down, and the only grounds that could be evidenced for it being turned down was race. As I say, the students themselves, we were 2,500 white students. Mm-hmm. I used to find it very difficult to understand because we'd come up from North Carolina, and I used to find it really hard to understand how we'd be standing, pledging allegiance to the flag of the United States every morning with our hands on our hearts, sort of like with the principles of equality and freedom. And then you'd have Black students going past in their own buses as they were being bused to separate schools. And certainly in North Carolina, in Raleigh, sort of like they weren't allowed to be in the same cafes or restaurants or anything like that. Not that we went out an awful lot, but it was very noticeable that there was a massive effort to preserve the sort of like the white supremacy that was there, that was present at the time.
Were they allowed to catch the school bus to their own school?
Yeah, because it was just full of Black students.
No, I meant to EC Glass when they first were allowed to catch the bus.
I don't know the truth of that, but I think they were dropped off by the family. I think the stress on those kids was so significant that to add an additional layer of stress would have been completely unacceptable. To put them on a bus of white children would have been horrendously intimidating. And also potentially confrontational. The idea, as I could see it, looking, with hindsight, was that the young people just wanted to come to school. They just wanted to get their schooling and move on. And it's interesting to me that uh, both of them actually achieved higher education. Um, as I said, Linda Woodruff became a professor, um, and she was a professor of uh, physical sciences in some respect. I don't know if it was physical education, but certainly sort of like, I don't know whether it was physical therapy even, but she was certainly linked into that sort of level of study. Down, she ended up in Atlanta before she died. And Owen Cardwell actually came back to Lynchburg, having lived elsewhere. He came back to Lynchburg quite recently, and he's a very well respected advisor on inclusive education and the need for accessible education for everybody. And indeed, uh, Professor or Dr. Linda Woodruff um, actually challenged actively um, educational structures that were excluding, certainly for students on the grounds of race. Um, and she set up or in her memory, there's now uh, a sort of like a special grant award for students to study in Atlanta in her name. Um, Owen Cardwell, I think he's Dr. Owen Cardwell, I think he's a theological doctor. Is, as I say, he's an educationalist, but he um, has been a strong and vocal advocate um, against discrimination, specifically racial discrimination. And I cannot help but think that both of these young people must have been so determined in order to brave the gates of EC Glass at that time, let alone the court battles that they'd been through, um, and to face the isolation. And they didn't know what they were walking into. I mean, you know, we as white students, they'd never had that experience. They'd only ever been to the Afro-American school, Dunbar. And so they had no idea of what was going to happen when they came into 2,500 white students, um, and you know how people would respond to them. Uh, as I say, I think that in itself would have caused isolation. I only hope and trust that they had support at a personal level to deal with. Um, I can only think it must have been very confusing for them, very mixed feelings that they were having. They must have been triumphant. I can imagine they were triumphant at actually being able to attend EC Glass because it was such a big thing to do, and there was so much attention on them as well. You know, they had to behave, you know, in a manner which was befitting because everybody would have been pointing fingers at them.
Yeah,
But I think,
and I
you know,
guess
they're just quiet students who just wanted to get on and, you know, get their education.
they would also have some sort of pressure about I don't know, like proving um, that other students after them should also have the right. That must have been quite a lot of like anxiety as well on top of that. Not to
Absolutely.
fail, I guess.
Absolutely. And, you know, they clearly, well, I'm sure they had their hiccups along the way, but they were clearly determined, um, and were able to open the doors for others. As I say, I found the school environment just too much. I couldn't cope with it. Um, you know, my mental health wouldn't even allow me to. I didn't finish my sophomore year. I ended up in local hospital initially, at Virginia Baptist Hospital locally, and then was sent over the country to another state institution in Williamsburg, and then ended up in Stanton at Western State. And I was there until we came back to England. So yeah, it was. I found it completely overwhelming. I liked the subjects, but I couldn't cope with the environment. I couldn't cope with the the rush and the bustle. I couldn't cope with the rushing from one class to another because it was set up very much like a college setup. So you might have had a home room, but the expectation was that for the subjects that you took during the week, you went to you went around the school to different rooms, to different places. And I guess in a way that probably would have helped um, Owen and Linda at the time, because it meant they could mingle, they could move from one place to another. They weren't static, they weren't sitting targets. Whereas I found it completely overwhelming. Clearly, I wasn't as strong as them at that time, and I just take my hat off to them. Because the story really, in relation to me, is just that I was there. I was there at that point in history. And for a brief time, I was fortunate enough to move alongside these two exceptional young people who turned out to be exceptional leaders. Um, and I was so fortunate to be able to do that. Um, and whatever cognitive dissonance was being created for me, that fact is unchallengeable. And what they did for the community, what they did for the nation, for the country, and what they did for civil rights is a tremendous tribute to them.
Do you know if they faced barriers after leaving the school and going on to, would it be university next? I don't really know the.
Yeah,
And universities were also segregated, weren't they? So were they integrated by this point, or did they have to fight to carry on into university?
they would have been going into university about 66, 67, I think. Um, and one of I found a lovely video, um, little bit of film, a little bit of footage from Dr. Linda Woodruff. I've sent you the link, so if you get a chance, do check it out. Where she was talking about having to make do with substandard education at a collegiate level and having to make do with substandard qualifications when she and her colleagues should have been working to a much higher standard and well, they were actually working to a much higher standard, but that standard wasn't being recognized. And I think that really, from what I read, that really motivated her to becoming um, uh, an articulate advocate for proper education, for appropriate education, um, and inclusive education, and non-discretionary education, certainly on the basis of race. Um, she was very, very committed, from what I can read, um, during her career and her lifetime, to that goal. And I think that's exactly right, Jess. I think sort of like when she was doing her when she was at college and then doing her postgrad, I think she was facing massive discrimination. And maybe that also was the case for Owen, because he, as I say, he stayed as an educationalist all his life. As well as being a religious leader. I think he's a Baptist minister. Um, but he has had tremendous influence on the educational systems, and now back in Lynchburg where he started, to be able to argue the case and to ensure that education is fair and equal for all.
Shall we have a walk around the block?
Okey-doke. God, it is enormous, isn't it?
It is. I don't know how far we can.
You know, those trees, they're quite big, but they were there probably when I was there, because they are so large, aren't they? They're sort of so
Yeah.
when you look out the windows, you should be able to see trees, which is nice.
I think this is where we were earlier. Yes. So that
I
different entrances. Oops.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think as this campus has grown, I think it's been divided up. So, you know, sort of like where I was there in 62, probably all the classes were in the same building. It looks to me as if there's quite a lot of new build all around the back. So my guess is that they've divided up into science blocks and sports blocks, and you know, that sort of thing.
It looks like they've got good facilities now. You sent me the link, I guess, which was sort of like an open day during the pandemic.
Yes, yes, that's right. Yes, it does, doesn't it? I mean, I think it's interesting to me that a school which was featured so dramatically and so emphatically, um, as a focus for integration and the breakdown of racial segregation, has moved, with the population, with the communities, with society into, the 21st century in an active way. I think I find that very, um, reassuring. But it's also interesting to me to see the streets, because I know when I came to London, when I came back to London, um, it was quite hard for me to cope with the streets. They were so small in London. When you look at, if you look at the panorama, it's sort of like there's so much space, isn't there? Everywhere. You know, there's, if you go to the streets, there's trees, there's grass, there's space between the houses. When I came back to England, I was massively claustrophobic because I just couldn't cope with the narrowness of the streets. And don't forget, we were in mid-60s, so the cars in the States were enormous as well. The roads were enormous. The Americans were enormous, I guess. And to come back to England and the cars were small. Don't forget, there was, at that time, there were the Minis and the Morris Minors and the Ford Anglias and those sort of cars around. So they were really quite small by comparison. And the roads were so narrow, and I could never work out where the traffic was coming from. And additionally, I, by this time, had developed a deep Southern accent, and nobody could understand a word I was saying. So it took me quite a while to reintegrate into English life, and you know, sort of being part of London. My family came from London, so it's not as if it was completely strange to me. And happily, I had my family around me at the time. Um, Certainly on my mother's side, but I did find it all very strange. It was very dystopian. It was hard to understand because I couldn't understand the English schooling structure at all, having come from the Americans. It's interesting, Jess, what you said about not understanding how the American school system works. I found the reverse. I just had no idea. People were talking about third formers and fourth formers and, you know, this, that, and the other. I didn't know what they were talking about. And there were technical colleges. I actually went to a technical college when I came out of hospital, when I'd been more rehabilitated. I went to a technical college and got a couple of qualifications, but I mean, my poor old mind was just so damaged by the treatment that it was really hard for me. So, sort of it took a long time to be able to become at all socially competent and able to speak to people who I didn't know. And indeed, to go down the street, I'm still a little bit sort of like unhappy about going out on the street on my own. Although when I lived on the south coast, that got a lot better. But sort of as I've got older, I find it a little bit overwhelming. But it's interesting. Lynchburg has a strange history. I'm looking at the map, and I can see Central Lynchburg General Hospital. Well, that's not where I went. I was sent to Virginia Baptist. But Lynchburg itself had an institution at the time in the 60s, all over, certainly Virginia, that's all I know about for sure, but I think all over the rest of the country. There were loads of institutions for disabled people, and the institution in Lynchburg became infamous because they subjected the patients or the inmates to mandatory anti-reproductive surgery, so they were sterilized and weren't even told about it.
No, that happened in this country as well, in the UK.
Yeah, but I think the one in Lynchburg, it became a national scandal, and I think there was a lot of attention directed towards that, and I think that was actually ultimately it was a radical gate breaking down exercise, but unfortunately there were people who had experienced that. It was people with learning difficulties and people who had epilepsy who were put in these institutions. It's the same thing, as you're right, Jess, actually the same thing happened over here. We were put away, we were taken away out of public view, and what happened there was, God, who was to say, because it was very badly monitored, if monitored at all. So things like that did happen. Where I ended up in Western State Hospital in Stanton, there was a blind school just up the road as well. And again, it was right in the middle of nowhere. Virginia is a big state. There's a lot of area in it. And the state mental institution, or the lunatic asylum as it had been, was way out of everybody's sight. And I think because the school for the blind kids was just up the road, they were similarly very, very separated. So one of the difficulties that I think young people had in the 60s in Virginia was that of isolation, whatever that looked like. It might have been, in like my experience of being completely overwhelmed by high school, or completely isolated because of race, in the case of Owen and Linda, or put away, indeed, as I became, because of my mental health. And I think very often Lynchburg, if you say Lynchburg generally, I don't think it's so much the breaking down of segregation that Lynchburg is remembered for, but more the institution. As I say, we went there because of it being my dad's job. He was working there. I don't think my mum was very happy there at all. I think she found it very difficult. And my sister was only a toddler, so she didn't know. She wasn't really involved. She was at home with my mum.
Did you want to go see any of the open space right now? Did you?
Well, let's have a quick look before we finish. That would be nice.
Where would be a good place to go? Do you know? The river, or?
I think the river's interesting because it's sort of like as so many of these places, the river, it's the River James, isn't it? Yes, the James River. actually the colonizations followed the river and the river sources, and industry very often followed the course of the rivers. Sort of, it's actually just, oh, look at that. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's through here. More trees.
Yeah, absolutely. We see, that's what I grew up with. I find it interesting. It's, it is so different, isn't it?
It is.
So different. Imagine the river's on the left.
Yes.
I think I can just see it through the tree.
You can go on. Is this a bridge?
Oh, wow, look, yes.
Look at zoom in.
So in itself would be off to the right. and the river itself actually looks quite placid at the moment.
So dusty as well, isn't it?
Sorry, love.
It's very dusty as well. You can kind of see how like hot it is on the road.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got a heat haze there. So it was obviously, and if you look at the trees and the grass, it's obviously taken sort of in the, oh, that's interesting. You see the mountains in the back?
Yes, here.
I think that's the Blue Ridge Mountains. And the Blue Ridge Mountains is, I was at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains when I was in, put into Western State. But yeah, I mean, that river looks gorgeous, actually. But the river itself well, rivers throughout the country were so significant in the colonization of the states. And I think it's useful to remember as well, 1962 was less than 100 years after the ending of the Civil War, the American Civil War. So less than 100 years after slavery was banished, these two young students took up the banner and came to school, which was an amazing thing to do. Because when you think about, if you look at the history of this country, and we have history going back centuries after centuries after centuries, 100 years is not very much time. It's not a long time. When you think about how the settlements grew up all over the country at the expense of the indigenous peoples, obviously, and introducing slavery, obviously, as a means to expand. It all happened in such a short period of time. I never used to get it talking to English people who had a different sense of time than me. For me, I think I was just located really in that moment in time. But it was, thinking about it in the context of 1962, an awful lot happened on every single level in the States in less than 100 years. But it's nice to see the Blue Ridge Mountains. My dad used to take us up to the Blue Ridge Mountains, to the skyway there, and we used to drive, and it was a wonderful thing. It was so different from anything that we had experienced. In Canada, we'd been surrounded by mountains, and it was very rural where we lived in Granby in Quebec, and Nebraska was very flat. North Carolina was just very strongly urbanized. But sort of Virginia, the countryside in Virginia is unlike anything that I've ever seen anywhere else. A friend of mine went to scout camp in West Virginia, and he drove down the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he did a FaceTime thing. So he had his phone on his dashboard. He had rented a car, and he was driving along, and it felt like coming home. It felt, excuse me, really nice, really welcoming.
Did you want me to quickly have a look around, like the more urban area?
Yeah, it could be interesting, couldn't it?
We can just have a quick look through. I don't quite know where I'm going.
I think that's okay, isn't it? Doesn't matter if we don't where we're going. It's interesting to me now, looking at the streets, how the cars are very similar to cars that you find in this country. We lived a bit out of town, so we lived more on the outskirts. Um, although you can see the streets are quite wide,
Yeah.
even. And the architecture is very different, isn't it, Jess? It's
Very different.
yeah. It doesn't have the same history. It doesn't have the same architectural roots. I always liked houses with balconies. I always thought there was something very attractive about them. But I think this is really interesting because I think it gives you a sense of Lynchburg being a small town. Although it is a city, it's got such a small town feel about it, hasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The streets are just so different from what you'd find over here. So it seems like the buildings that have got the most majesty are the buildings that are either sort of like public sector buildings
Yeah.
or uh, community-based religious buildings.
There's quite a lot of churches that have been passed already.
There is. I mean, it's very strongly Baptist. Or it used to be. Maybe it's different now. I don't know.
The building is also quite a lot bigger than what we have.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's right. That's right. But I don't think there's many residential. Oh, yeah, of course, it's a business district, isn't it? So that's why.
Yeah, it says there. I can go somewhere else.
Can we just pop up to the outskirts a little bit?
I'll come out here. Where would be the outskirts be?
I have no idea. Fairview Heights. Let's try Fairview Heights.
Trying to find it.
Yeah, that's residential, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it interesting? Bungalows would be called ranch styles. So ranch style houses. They're basically they're split level.
They are. They're just lowered down on the ground, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting when you've got so much space that they haven't been built up.
This looks like a main road.
You see what I mean about the roads? They are enormous by comparison. You know, those are just sort of like urban roads.
Yeah,
They're not
what we would have an A road over here. Oops.
yeah.
I'm stuck on this bit now.
So we would have used the road really just to get from one place to the other. My dad used to go off to work. My mum was at home. with my sister and me. As I say, my sister's a lot younger. And we hung out in our neighborhood as far as I can remember, or we went to school. At that time, I wasn't going to any of the churches, so sort of that wasn't another um, excursion at all. Um, that's interesting. If you just bring the little hand down and over to the left, up a bit, to the right, up. That's it. See that little white thing there that's on the corner?
Oh, that's
That's
a hydrant.
that's exactly right. There are fire hydrants like that all over the place, and they're public water supplies in case of fire or emergencies, which we don't get over here.
No, unless it's in like a really important building.
Yeah, and then it's sort of like it's built into the structure of the building itself, isn't it? But yeah, it's interesting to me to see the wide roads, the green, and the trees, and it really helps me to understand why I was so claustrophobic when I came to London.
Well, thank you for coming on a walk with me today.
Oh, Jess, thank you for your patience with me. I hope you found the links interesting, and it's certainly been very interesting for me. As I say, I could never be there in person because I cannot see the American government ever giving me a pardon for having been mentally ill. So, let alone being disabled now.